shall come to pass afterward, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants, upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. We're continuing today in the book of Genesis. Some interesting things here. So, we're picking it up. I'm not going to read through the whole story of the attempted seduction of Joseph, just because it's like, I don't know, a scene of seduction. I don't know how many times do I want to read it. Joseph escaped the sin, but not punishment. But he did escape a worse fate. To corrupt your character, it is better to suffer the injustice of the world than to corrupt your character. There's certain fundamental things about God that are understood by the patriarchs, the fathers. You gotta watch for that and understand. He said Joseph communicates some very important truths, and also some very important clues about, I think, the Bible. When you think about it logically. So let's read the passage we're having to do with today, and then I have some things I want to say generally about this whole story, and also we're going to look at the story itself. So we were going to pick it up, and so we're not going to read the whole story. Sometimes we pick up the whole context, especially, but in this context, I think it's fine to, we've shifted gears here. Now he's in prison. We know why he's in prison. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And it came to pass after these things, that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers, against the chief of the bakers, and he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard, into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and continued a season in ward. And they continued a season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said unto him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. And Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, and pressed them into Pharaoh's cups, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head, and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup unto his hand, or into his hand. What do I say? Into his hand, after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into this dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I was also in my dream, and behold, I had 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there was all manner of bake meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. So it goes. And sometimes it feels hard to stop at any point in the story, because it goes on from there. 2 more years pass by before the Pharaoh's dream comes. But there's enough meat here for today, believe me, because there's lots to talk about here, and something more general. I think I need a sip of water, actually. Oh, well, I'm just going to mute it while I have a sip, okay? So you don't have to listen to the swallowing. It's kind of, some people might not like it. It's definitely polite when you have a mic on not to drink close to the mic, I think, right? Most people probably don't care, but there's a few people who it's going to be, annoying to. I try not to make it viscerally unpleasant to listen to this. I know there were some older studies where there's a lot of sniffling and stuff. I try to be more polite and not sneeze and sniffle and, sorry. Oh, boy. So, So the Lord was with Joseph, showed him mercy, and he gives him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. He becomes, and the keeper of the prison commits to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Like I said before about the Jews, in in the time of the Babylonian captivity, the children of the Jews, like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, with their new names, they were promoted in their captivity. Because, and so Joseph also finds, even in his now he was sold as a slave into a good position. Now he's put but his skills are still being used. But I noticed, the story is kind of the same. But here's the interesting thing. I would really think, when people say, they try to suggest that all the Old Testament was written down in Babylon, and prior to that, it didn't exist. There's a skeptical textual criticism, and I don't buy into that. You think about this. By the time the Babylonian captivity came to pass, the northern tribes of Israel had been pretty much wiped out, and whatever was left of them had been amalgamated into Judah, and were understood to were called Jews. That term had already kind of lost its specificity. But even so, why is the leading tribe in this story Joseph? You'd think it would be Judah. Just for the sake of, because the story of Israel is a tragedy for Joseph. The story of Joseph is it is tragic in its initial telling and in his rise, but in what happens to his sons, as far as, not his sons themselves personally, but his tribe. Though his name is brought up in Revelation in honor of him, the tribe of Ephraim, his not his firstborn, his secondborn, but who was given the blessing of firstborn by Jacob himself, crossing his arms. And Ephraim indeed was a great tribe, and Manasseh. But Ephraim, but they were. I mean, the things written about Ephraim in the prophets are very, very harsh. The tribe, and so in like I'm saying, like by the time you get to Babylon, it's so interesting. Like the thought that they would at that point then read their history, like the thought would be, oh, they look back on their history and they make it up at Babylon, and they make all these stories up. If at Babylon you were going to make all these stories up, you wouldn't start off with Joseph being the one in the multicolored coat and being like the child of promise. You would start off with Judah, because ultimately Judah carried the whole kingdom forward, and the whole law of Moses things forward, and the whole covenant of Abraham forward to the time of Christ. And they still do in their way, obviously. And it's like, well, and again, to categorize the whole group, there's always been apostates from Christianity, apostates from Judaism, and it's often confusing whether they consider themselves an ethnicity or a religion. It's a bit of both. I mean, it's like you don't really get to choose. I mean, you can make it for yourself, one or the other. Someone could choose to, I'm going to be, just ethnically Jewish, but not religiously, or both, or sometimes even people take on the Jewish religion without taking on, because they can't ethnically be Jews, but they'll take on the religion. For marriage purposes, they have to convert. And in some, corners of that, I suppose it's allowed. I don't know how that worked exactly. Under the Old Testament, that was a little bit, the way in which that went would be kind of limited. It was usually like, I don't know, there's a lot of don't take their daughters for wives and their sons for husbands with certain peoples. And it wasn't so much about ethnic racism, because they weren't ethnically that different from each other. It's not racism as we understand it. I mean, it was not like that. That was not really the thing. It wasn't that they looked that different from each other. But they were different from each other. That there is no doubt. The Hebrews had a very different way of being. I mean, you look in Joseph's ideas. So I think that Joseph's prominence in Genesis is a real, I think it's a real punch against anyone who claims that, like, oh, this stuff is all made up in Babylon. It just doesn't make sense to me. I understand there's definitely, from the time of Babylon, you can see influence. And other things I see is more like things that like seem like that they were perhaps things that got into the text during the time when Israel was in the land, like which is in Beersheba to this day. And a lot of those little commentaries to this day makes me feel like, is this Joshua? Because here's the thing, Moses receives perhaps some amount of writing about this. I don't know. It's not written down, so it's purely speculation. Because I can't. It was all oral tradition at that point, perhaps. Because like I said, I don't think this was all dictated from Mount Sinai, because that's not claimed either. But these stories, like I said, I trace it back to Abraham. Because it's even asserted in the story that they were men of understanding. You know what I mean? Like who could perhaps keep their own stories. They were men of great wealth. It's not like, Abraham wasn't just a goat herder. You know what I mean? He was a man who owned lots of animals because he was extremely wealthy and he could afford things like a story. Especially with, like I said, so great a house. But it's funny because they have so few children at the beginning. Not until Jacob. And then he requires... the fact that to have 12 children, he needed 4 different women. I guess the women who, I'm always very impressed with women who on their own have a lot of children. Let's leave that there. And of course, Joseph, when he's in the prison, he exerts like I said, the same kind of gifts. They manifest themselves. And, gifts need room. And for that, God has to make favor with those who are in charge of certain things where you happen to be. I've only had really good experience in churches where God gave me favor in the sight of the people in charge. Where they saw what I was doing and they were of, whatever. It's like, I don't claim to be perfect, but I am of, I'm genuine. Not that I do think that's important. I don't think that's, being your most genuine self. I don't mean that. I mean, letting the things you say be genuinely the things you think are the truth, and going sincerely after that in a responsible way. At least in a somewhat responsible way, and not just like going along with a party line or something like that. I think that's to me very valuable. I want, it's something I value. Because I feel like I have to be genuine with God. I can't be fake. I can't deceive Him, and I'm trying to let that reflect also outwardly to people around me. It's not so easy. On either front, that's not easy. God isn't always, He doesn't like to be all obvious about his. He wants to be able to I want to be able. It's like with my kids. I want to be able to walk out of the room or leave the house and know I'm not going to come back and find the thing torn apart. I'm not going to find the place of wreck or burned down. You want to in on God's secret playground? Quote unquote. I'm being a little. I'm trying to understand that there's a value to that we're here for a purpose. And God will judge us. Joseph, I don't know that he has any notion of resurrection or anything, but it's like doing the right thing for its own sake is the best thing you could do. And God honors him in that in the earth. And it's like, but he also, it says, he gave him favor, but he's in prison. It'd be very easy to get down about being imprisoned. Even if you had, just like, hey, no, even if you're like, oh, well, why complain you're a slave in the house of a very rich dude? Well, no one wants to be a slave in the rich. He isn't excited about his slavery, even though it's better than being in a salt mine or a galley slave. Of course. I don't, I do make apology for it in a certain sense because the Bible, just like divorce, which also I think is wrong. Divorce is wrong. It's wrong. No, it's right. No, it's wrong. It's like, well, you married the wrong person. Now you need a divorce. So you did two wrongs, but two wrongs don't make a right. As my dad always liked to say, It's all wrong. But there are degrees, right? There are degrees of wrong. Like some divorces are really, really bad. Others, you can look at it from one person's perspective and say, well, they have a just cause. Someone did wrong, right? There's no divorce that ever happened without somebody screwing up, right? You know what I mean? Like, there's no, I forgot which one, the famous comedian. There was never like a marriage that was just going along beautifully and they got along and they loved each other and then, but they just got divorced for no reason. That would be indeed, a great tragedy. But that doesn't happen. There's always some wrong done. The one to the other, some mismatch, some misfit, maybe wrong in the beginning. They didn't properly assess who they were marrying, so they married stupidly. And they're both culpable in that regard. They had no business being together in the first place. It's the problem is people don't put enough restraint on their sexual activity to learn to, to look for a mate. As opposed to, I don't know. A lot of people are looking for mates. A lot of people are. I just think of when I was young and the foolishness that I listened to at the time, The wars within that way did the Lord made to prosper. So now comes the dreams of the butler and the baker. Right? So Pharaoh they somehow offended the king. And these are, you understand, these two individuals, though they again are like servants, the butler is some sort of cupbearer. It's an important position. It is an important position because it's a position of trust. it is a funny thing to have a cup bearer, but my cup is important to me. Like I have a cup I drink out of. But for Pharaoh, it might have been even a ceremonial importance. There's a whole issue with a cup later on where Joseph uses a cup as a sort of a plant to plant it on Benjamin to see how his brothers will, whether or not they will like just betray their other brother, who's his full brother, their half brother. See that whether they will, we'll get to that. Like I said, certain parts of Genesis, like the generations of Esau, they didn't make it into my children's Bible, but all this stuff did, and so it's very memorable to me. And so sometimes I get ahead of it, but I'm also not quite sure how many people have, might be listening. They've never heard it. I'm sure you've all heard this part of the story. I remember when I was young, I didn't like things like the cartoon versions of these or I would be very critical of them for not being precisely like the Bible. And because I think it was more of and I certainly like things that are precise. I like the precision. But even in the ones that are precise, I found myself unsatisfied. Like there was the Gospel of John, a movie that I definitely approve of. And also the Matthew movie, where was the Gospel of Matthew pretty much word for word from one or other of the translations. I wish they would do a King James one, which would be fun. But except that I wouldn't want it to be word for word because it would be almost certain parts wouldn't work so well. But I wouldn't like the way they portrayed Jesus, or how they cast him, or whatever. There was some aspect that eventually I realized, it's no one has the perfect portrayal. There's no such thing. You can, in isolation, it's kind of got its perfection. The Bible, the biblical text on its own is perfect the way it is, as far as like it's got everything we need. It's fun to watch things that are embellishments on that, as long as they don't tread into things that are, that I would say are contrary. I'm willing to humor a bit of it, because I do look at it like when Jesus, there's a difference between, say, the people who are, where Jesus said, or where his disciples said, that we saw one casting out devils, but we forbid him because he doesn't go with us. And Jesus said, no, don't forbid him. I don't want to get in the way of people making Jesus movies, right? I don't want to be negative about it. When people, I don't, but on the other hand, it can go too far. Like the woman who followed Paul. These are the servants of the Most High God who show us the way of salvation. It's like, hey, how about we do gay Jesus? We'll do gay, queer, transsexual Jesus. Then obviously that's too far. I don't want them to do that, right? We're almost destined to have it, I guess, right? They like to insinuate that anyways. That's fine. Let them insinuate. Again, I consider myself pretty thick-skinned about it, because I don't have I think that sensitivity comes from needing the other people to believe. I don't care if they believe or not. I believe it's like, I know how even when you believe, your faith can be so much less than you realize. And you can have so much more than you realize when the Lord gives it. Lord, increase our faith. If a mustard seed size amount of faith is enough to move a mountain, many of us might be doing with substantially less. I don't know. I usually take that as encouragement, but it could be seen as a discouragement. I remember there was one of those fake gospels. It was written much later, and they portrayed the apostles as going out and trying to speak commandingly to mountains, and then going away with their heads down and their shoulders slunk, disappointed, because they couldn't get them to move, right? But the point is, prayer isn't. The point of prayer is not to move mountains. The point of faith is not to move waters, because you can't. You have no such power to do such things. Certainly not by thinking it's true. The power of faith is the power to engage with God and have Him act on His behalf through you. And that's the thing. It's always in His name. You got to do things in His name. You don't get to just God isn't just here to give us some sort of power trip. Obviously, He's put us in a very limited state. He's shown us very clearly how frail our lives are. They are frail. So, life, it can be kind of tough, and it can persist and hold on, but it's also like a breath of wind. It passes away and then it's gone. So the thing here, I think, that is the central to me of this passage, and we could talk about the dreams, just reading it is enough, right? For the most part. In the house of the captain of the guard. It's interesting. Joseph was bound in the prison, which was in the house of his master. He's still kind of running things for Potiphar. He couldn't bring himself to, he was so valuable, I think, that he couldn't bring himself, either one, he didn't believe his wife entirely, like they insinuated in that movie. Because again, these are things you could speculate about. I think it's fun that they speculate, like, Potiphar was like, I don't know. She's kind of, maybe this is, he's faithful. But she's always been a bit, whatever, I don't know. I can't imagine, honestly, because, I couldn't imagine. I just can't imagine in my own life. I can imagine in someone else's life, a wife behaving so. It's like, my wife, to me, that's unimaginable. I can't, she I trust. I don't need someone to run my house, But the central verse, they dreamed, right? And they, in one night, and they were bound in the prison. I don't know if that means they were actually physically bound or just the fact that they were locked up. They were locked up. They were sad, right? But without going, whatever. The main thing what he says is, do not interpretations belong to God. I think that's such an important thought. It's reiterated in the New Testament, right? No prophecy comes of any private interpretation. Meaning, interpretations aren't for me to make. People say it's like, oh, it's all up to all that, this could be this, that could be that. A lot of times people say that about prophecy and interpretation. But the assertion is that the true meaning of things, if things have a true meaning, everything with meaning, that belongs to God. That meaning belongs to God. It's not for me to assign. I don't assign meanings to it. They have meanings in and of themselves which are come of God. Because a lot of times people, there's the search for meaning. Right? That's part of what is the meaning of life? And that's essentially, what is the interpretation of all this? What's this all mean? Interpretations. Like, what does this mean? Meaning belongs to God. So I think people are so obsessed with, not obsessed, but many people are very attracted to Jordan Peterson. He's very obsessed with meaning. Interpretation. And if you've got the right interpretation, if you've got it correct, meaning, and if it's a meaningful story, a meaningful message, if it's from God, then the interpretation is also of God. I mean, you don't get what God, because people the heathen, they look at the flight of birds and they say, oh, well, it means this and it means that. But unless God imbues that with meaning, you're just looking at the meaningless flight of birds. Interpretations belong to the Lord. If there's an interpretation, it belongs to God. Now, out of the multitude of business cometh forth a dream. Now, a lot of times you can interpret your dreams yourself. But like, oh yeah, I had a dream about this because I was talking about that earlier in the day, or there's something happened, and you can often find out why you have the dream. And it's not the interpretation, and the true interpretation, it is a right thing. It's not necessarily, this doesn't mean, by the way, that dreams are a message from God. That's not what that's saying. Dreams can be a message from God. But the point is, the correct interpretation of things is of God. It is not something for men to speculate over, or, we could debate it because we don't know. Like, if we don't know the interpretation, like they said, we don't know. We don't know what the interpretation is. We have no interpreter. Let's look up the word interpretations after I say all that, right? Because that's just the feeling I got. And I stand by what I said. It may not work so well with the word here, but as far as the strict meaning of the word, I don't know. I forgot I don't have my internet yet. It's supposed to be here tomorrow, but not for the study. It's going to be after the study is over when my replacement satellite connector thing is going to supposedly be here. And I have every reason to believe it will be. I checked the status on it. It's still on schedule. No delays. So that would be pleasing. So do not interpretations belong to the Lord? Okay, interpretations. Pithron. No definition and interpretation. Use not. Wow. Englishman's Concordance. I guess it's used. It's only used 5 times in the whole Bible, and honestly, it's just in these couple chapters. So, and it means interpretation. So there we go. I stand by what I said. Interpretation is what? Finding the meaning in something. To take something that is like a story that has something you suspect there's meaning there. Right? But a lot of times we don't know what the meaning is. Like there's been times when you hear a story and you don't understand what it means. Right? It doesn't, and again, don't take this as overly axiomatic, thinking that the interpretation of that, but in a sense also that if you have a good story, deriving the proper meaning of it, what you should take away from it. Because there are all kinds of things that happen, right? But the way we frame what happened, the way we interpret what happened, is the perspective on things, and it often is colored by our perspective on things, right? We have, if we have a right-wing perspective, we look at it this way. If we have a left-wing perspective, I try to divorce myself from my perspective whenever it's plausible, and even when it's hard, I try to do it a bit because it's useful. I find I can be more effective in arguing against things and also arming myself against things and defending myself against things if I can understand them, as opposed to just resist. Resist with a knee-jerk reaction of no. It's like, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with, certainly with some things, to just say no. But I'm talking about more just ideas that we may not, because there are still things which we do not know are good or bad. There are things that are happening in the world where it's like, well, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? A lot of times I do think I know, but when they first come out, it's not obvious. Like, I think when I try to keep an open mind about things when they were asking people to get shots and stuff, but the thing is, I already had that same illness at least once and probably twice in different forms. The first time was just way too early, but now we know it was, oh no, that was not too early. They were just all too late. And not that it was, too late for what? It's like, well, I don't want to talk about that. But interpretations belong to God. Now tell me, and why does he tell, why, oh, tell me, that's kind of arrogant. I don't think it's arrogant, but it's like, but it might come off as like confident anyways, right? There's some certain confidence there, like, tell me. I understand interpreting dreams. It's interesting, when he told his parents and his brothers his dreams, he didn't mention knowing what it meant, but they seem to know what it meant. And that's interesting because perhaps They knew what it meant because that was, again, something that the interpretation of dreams, the meaning of symbols, the thought of, what a story might represent. There's a sophistication there among Joseph and his family. Now, not that the Egyptians aren't sophisticated, but Joseph is not just some goat herd, as they taught. Goat herds were the people that worked for Abraham. Joseph had many goat herders working for him and his sons. It's like they had flocks and sheep and men servants and all that stuff. I mean, it might render them unpalatable to certain people today, but it's like, I always think it's funny, you judge people who lived in a different world as if they lived in your world. And it's such a narcissistic point of view, and also judging people when you haven't really sufficiently examined yourself is just completely out of touch. But like I said, we kind of walked over this stuff. The captain of the guard charged Joseph was put in charge of these two guys. That's interesting, And they continued in ward, and he was the one who charged them and served them because, again, though they are being put in prison, they are important people. And they're not treated like scum immediately because it's not that they're being permanently yet. It's like, this is just a holding thing. Like, take them away and put them in prison is just sort of like, okay, a couple days later he might feel better about it. And they both had dreams and they were sad about it. And he says, well, tell them to me, right? And then they tell them, and the first one is the one with the vine, 3 branches, and it started to bud, and her blossoms, and the clusters brought forth grapes, I had Pharaoh's cup in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and give him, it sounds like a good dream. And Joseph understands even deeper that the 3 branches are 3 days in this dream. That this is a special dream. That this dream means something. And the only way you can really know that is through the power of the Holy Spirit, as far as I know. They do belong to God, but Joseph asked to be told because in some way he's going to consult with God. As he prays with God, he prays to God. That part is not necessarily there, but the Spirit of God reveals these things to him. Because it says the Lord was with him. So in what way is the Lord with him? The Lord walking with him as a physical being? No, in the Spirit of God is present with him. And throughout the Old Testament, does it say the Spirit of the Lord was upon him? I think that's something that comes in more in the he was well favored and all this stuff, and the Lord was with him is about all he gets here, as far as the extensiveness of the description. I mean, I'm not saying it was the same as the way the Holy Spirit inhabits us as Christians, because it's just a different time and place and all that. It's not the same gift, but whatever. It's going to be similar as far as I would assume. And so when the butler finishes telling the dream, it says, he says, hey, he's going to lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you're going to deliver the cup into your hand. Now, you're going to give Pharaoh's cup into his hand, a very favored position. It's to hand him over the cup, just like before. And then he immediately puts in a pitch for himself. Hey, but when it's going to go well with you, show me kindness, I pray you. Make mention of me unto Pharaoh and bring me out of this house. And then he tells his story. I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews. I've done nothing that they should put me into this dungeon. And then, so the chief baker saw the interpretation was good. The other guy says, hey, that's great. He says, let me tell you about my dream. And again, like a lot of people, we want the good we want our fortune told, but we want it to be good. The thing is, life doesn't always have good in store for us, right? Sometimes, just like Joseph, Joseph ended up in prison. And like we know, he continues at least 2 full years there, maybe more. And it's unjust. He did nothing wrong. All he did was continue to honor his master and to continue to serve him as best he could. I don't even know if he thought he doesn't even. It doesn't even appear that he accuses his master's wife. I mean, not that there's much to do with that. So in his dream, he's got 3 white baskets on his head. And in the uppermost, there's all kinds of baked meats, all kinds of baked goods. Baked meats would be better said baked goods, like bakery items. They often say meat, but it's put for all food. And the birds that eat them out of the basket upon my head. And that's not a good thing. That's one of the reasons why when I interpret the parable of the... several parables. Whenever birds come and do something, I'm like, the parable of the mustard seed. Then the birds come and lodge and they make their nests in the branches. To me, that's like, yes, the birds. all the negative religious, every negative religious figure you could think of, just think of them as a bird making a nest and crapping all over God's kingdom, because that's how I think of birds. When I lived in the suburbs, I hardly ever saw birds. I mean, we had birds around, but not like out here. And man, they get in my barn and stuff. And like I have, certain, especially sparrows. I mean, I just want to get rid of them, But I'm not really making any effort towards that. I just get them out of my barn, keep them out of the barn. With the 2 cats in the barn are helping with the sparrow problem. But yeah, they're dirty. They do a lot of bad things, and also the parable of the sower. The birds come along. What do? They steal the word of God from out of men's hearts. And what are the birds in that parable? Satan. So the enemy is often portrayed. Birds coming and eating stuff in a dream. Usually not good. Usually not good. He's got his baked meats on his head, and then all of a sudden the birds are getting at him. Oh, I think he was hoping for a good interpretation, but Joseph gives him a true interpretation. It's not a good dream. They were both sad because they didn't understand. You can be disturbed. What does it mean? It's like I'm filling up his cup again. But it's kind of obvious too, right? I mean, I don't want to be all like, I think that the 3 days thing is a little bit, I'm like, feel a bit, am I pushing it on that part? But I've had a lot of, like I said, I've had a lot of interpreted dreams, but most of them are just very mundane. It's like, what's going on? It's like, well, you were doing this, you were doing that, and then doing that. And it's not necessarily a prediction. But when you start getting weird symbols and stuff in your dream, I don't know, seeing very specifically 3 things. And like, I would think that a dream from God that really meant something would take on a character all its own. But it would also have an interpretation that is not, like I said, it's not for personal benefit. That's what the baker is hoping for, a nice interpretation, like as though the interpretation will lead the outcome. It almost feels like that, what I mean? A prophet speaks and then it comes to pass. And it seems like, well, did the prophet make it come to pass? Did he kill him with his words? Well, no, the dream came forth first, right? The interpretation isn't going to do it. But, oftentimes people don't like bad news. But it doesn't matter whether the baker likes it or not. It's, Pharaoh has a birthday party. He's like, 3 days and Pharaoh's going to lift up your head from off you. And the birds shall eat the flesh. He's going to hang you on a tree. I don't know if that's similar to crucifixion or some sort of hanging. Or it could be any kind of... Often they would use tree for some sort of upright stake. In fact, there's a whole group of people who insist Jesus was not hung on a cross, but rather an upright stake. In fact, E.W. Bullinger of the Companion Bible fame, that's his one of his biggest things is Jesus was not crucified on two pieces of wood put together at any angle. I remember at any angle. He was like, no, not any kind of cross. It was a stake, darn it, because of the meaning of the language and blah 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 blah. And I don't really get into that debate. I've looked at it and I just say, I'm like, yeah, I think the whatever. I don't know the exact provenance of everything, so I'm not going to make an argument for it right here because I don't want to ruffle anyone's feathers who is really up on that. But here's the thing is, you shouldn't make that the central core of what you believe. The reason I don't have all the arguments handy because I don't feel like my position that it's a cross is actually that essential. I'm not a Catholic, so I'm not going to have to adjust my way to genuflect or something like that. I'm going to, it doesn't matter. I accept the idea that Jesus was crucified on a cross, but again, it's not that important, genuinely. And I don't think that Bullinger got that bent out of shape about it, but I get it. You get people are always looking for, we want to get the story straight. And it's cool that we can still believe to this day that there's still more to learn. And it's funny because I think there is. In many ways, we haven't fully understood the message to the extent that we could. There is more yet for us to explore in the nature of things that God has delivered us through His Word. So he predicts this guy having a pretty gruesome end with his birds eating. He's going to be hung out to dry, and the birds are going to eat his flesh from off of him. And it's not usually the way you think about yourself, at your funeral. And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. Let's have a big party for my birthday, right? He lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among us. Look at these. He brings them. What he means is he brought them before everybody and exalted them sort of literally by bringing them out. Here we have them brought out of prison. Their heads, which had fallen down, so to speak, meaning we've talked about the symbolism of heads up and heads down in the prophets and stuff, right? And so he's lifting their heads is a way of he's just bringing them, all the servants in there. This is some sort of example setting type thing. The specifics of Pharaoh's intent are not important really because the whole issue is that Joseph is right, and that's the thing. Like it happens just like he said it would. So he lifted up their heads among both of them. Like I said, there's two ways. There's lifting up the head, like lift up your chinny chin chin, chin up. Everyone lifts a happy face, right? Or good old Charlotte's Web, right? There's that kind of lifting up of head. I'm gonna lift up your head and make you to smile again. There's also I'm gonna lift up your head and put it on a wall again. Not again, but that's the other side of it. And it's funny because right here it's apparent, the scripture is using that similarity. So he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. He's like, he was too happy and perhaps stunned by the whole thing to remember the guy who had brought it to pass. And, and the thing is, though this is on his part, this is not, this is he calls it a sin, I forget if he called it a sin or whatever, but he considers it, he has done no good for Joseph in this. And he felt he had done him wrong in some way, right, by not remembering him because he interpreted the dream. But it was probably well that because if he had been freed at that point, maybe he wouldn't have been around to interpret Pharaoh's dream, or maybe he would have. I don't know. But in any case, I guess we should read the next part because we can't really go on without doing that. So we'll start reading 41:1. And we may not get too far into this chapter, but we'll probably read the whole thing again tomorrow, so that's okay. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river, And behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke. Yeah, that would wake you up. Like, if think about that dream. That's a scary dream. And he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up on one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. It's got to be also kind of creepy. Because, how exactly did those ears eat the other ones? It's not corn. I think of ears of grain. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in ward. I'm sorry. There we go. In the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night. I and he, we dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was one with us, a young man, in Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard, and we told him. And he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was me he restored unto my office, and him he hanged. Oh, sorry, I get it. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. It's kind of not an easy read. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself, and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and ill-favored kine did eat up of the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them. But they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke. And I saw in a dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered, thin, and blasted, with the east wind sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. God hath showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of that famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, it is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, to take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt of the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for the store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such a one as this? Can we find such a one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the 2nd chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee! And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, a priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh, and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field, which was round about every city. Laid he up the same. And Joseph gathered the corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine. Before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. For God said, He hath made me forget all my toil, and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim. For God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction, because of fruitfulness, Ephraim. Actually, I think it means like double fruitful, I think. It's got im, so it's plural. Because I will look that up, I guess. Well, the funny thing is the reading of this chapter is taken to the end of the study. I'm reading it, and I'm like going to start the next study reading it, which I feel like I have to apologize for. We may read half. Actually, we may split this chapter in half tomorrow. Reading it ahead is good. It's good to get it in our mind. All right. So, the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, and what he saith to you do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt for Joseph to buy corn, because that the famine was sore in all lands. And I do think that this is almost like a second Noah's Ark. Like I said, I'm not an expert on it, but civilization collapsed. The civilization that had arisen unto this time, where the Hittites and the Canaanites and though some of those people continued to persist, many of the large kingdoms that had been stable and in communication with other large kingdoms collapsed due to not entirely understood forces at work at this time. And famine is indeed considered one of them, because there was something, I think, somewhat environmental is thought to have been responsible for the collapse of all these civilizations. It was over a period of time, so it's probably not one thing. It wasn't like, but in historical time, it was rather sudden. I mean, someday they'll talk about the sudden rise and fall of the American Empire. I think America will still be around, but the empire can't last forever. Certainly, especially since it does so little good. Certainly not, well, it does so much evil. It's not worth the little good it does. Especially certain aspects, right? Anyway, so we've run out of time. We're at an hour. I can't even begin to go into this. I think what I'll do is I'll decide to read some section that we're going to cover tomorrow on that, because it's going to be kind of like you just listen to the whole thing. So I don't know. But anyways, we're going to begin at chapter 41. So until next time, thanks for joining me, and I'll be back again tomorrow.
And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your old men shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants, upon the handmaids in those days will I pour out my spirit.